Here today, and I really want to thank Maddie and David and the Church Properties Initiative for bringing me out to speak to you. Just as a personal aside, I've never had the chance to be at Notre Dame before, but my grandfather went here, and I went to all-boys school run by Benedictine monks in St. Louis, so Notre Dame is often loomed large in the imagination. And it is certainly the most excited my mother has ever been about anything I've ever done with work. She often doesn't ask me what I'm doing, so thank you for that, certainly. So my name is Quinn Underriner. I'm a data scientist and policy researcher at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. For those of you who aren't familiar with that work, we are a multidisciplinary group of academics and policy researchers focusing on issues around housing affordability, land use, homelessness, the intersection of climate and housing policy, among other issues. And we really our real focus is producing work that informs policy, right? We're not interested in publishing strictly in academic journals, but we are actively engaging with the legislature in California and in DC to be like, how can we basically provide broader context to different housing issues, as they are actively occurring. And so that is kind of what I'm here to talk to you about today. So there was a bill passed in California a couple weeks ago that really makes it easier to build affordable housing on faith-based lands, which is kind of the culmination of a few years of effort in California and some research, that we have been kind of tracking over the last few years to see what the effects of this kind of work might be. So starting a couple years back in 2020 is when we first started to, enter into this space and there have been, in the ensuing years, a few different attempts by either state senators or assembly members to put forth bills that would make it easier to put different types of affordable housing on land owned by churches, right? And so kind of at the start of this process in 2020, we went out and, we started to do some data work, but then also wanted to go speak to both affordable housing developers and then also, owners, representatives and owners of church land, right? And so I'm trying to keep this very brief because I'm sure this is surprising to no one in this room. But what we were finding is that, specifically in the California context, people were really seeing that the housing crisis was a growing moral issue, right? So California is about 12% of the U.S. population, but we have about a third of the unhoused population, and I think most, notably over half of the unsheltered unhoused population, right? So not only is that a pretty visible part of people's lives, but really just the broader housing affordability crisis is pretty inescapable if you are a resident of California, right? This is going to affect pretty much the entire income spectrum of people, right? So as people were feeling that was, okay, we have some moral obligation to kind of engage with this, at this moment, we're also seeing, as kind of, I guess, discussed by the previous presentation, right? They're kind of a twin or a parallel trend of shrinking congregations, right? So churches were talking about we want housing to kind of keep our congregants in place because we were finding specifically that our congregation are shrinking. There's a lot of reasons, but one of them is they simply can't afford to live in these neighborhoods anymore, right? And trying to think about what can we do about that. But those kind of shrinking congregations meant that, there was space available for new uses. And in some cases, a need for new revenue sources, right? I don't want to go too far in detail on this, but just, the church obviously has a long history of kind of engaging with this kind of stuff, but certainly since Section 202 and HUD funding kind of changed and stopped giving out new grants, this has really changed a lot, from the way the church built housing decades past. But now in California, especially, a lot of churches were realizing, look, we are land rich and otherwise poor, and what can we do with that, right? So during that time period, there were a couple bills that attempted to be passed, including earlier versions of SB 4. And finally, about 3 weeks ago, SB 4, otherwise colloquially known as Yes in God's Backyard, was passed in California, which we are incredibly excited about. And so what this does is this streamlines the building of affordable housing on land owned both by faith-based organizations and also all institutions of higher learning. And so really, important in the California context is this means that you can build affordable housing through a ministerial process. So you can bypass local design standards and, very importantly, the California Environmental Quality Act, which, hey, love the environment, this is great, but typically, the way, I don't know if you're not familiar with how housing projects work in California, basically you can always sue a development under CEQA and demand an environmental review, and that adds 3 to 4 years to a project and millions of dollars in legal fees. And so not only does that kind of torpedo projects that are currently existing, but there's many more projects that just never get off the ground because developers don't want to touch them, right? and broadly too, and when we were speaking with congregations kind of in the first part of this process, some of these local design standards, right, around parking minimums, and just various other efforts by local groups are like, the classic, of course we want affordable housing, but not here, right? You can really just, cut development out of a lot of places. And so this basically says, and I'm happy to go into more details of the bill, but it's basically saying like, look, if what you're building is legal to build, you can do it, right? And that's, again, in California, a huge deal, right? That unlocks a lot of projects that would not have been financially viable that now are. So, to get that kind of protection, that you actually have to build pretty deeply affordable housing, right? So in this context, affordable means all units must be affordable to people who make 30 to 50% of the area median income, with some carve-outs. So you can have 20% for moderate income households. You can have some manager units. And if you do, the same way that LIHTC is, you have deed-restricted rentals for 55 years. And I believe if you want to have these houses be for sale to these low-income populations, then those are deed-restricted for 45 years. So where do we come into this broadly? This is the third time this bill was brought up and was finally passed. And so kind of in the lead up to this discussion, we wanted to provide some context as to what might it mean if California passed this bill. And so we were able to have the privilege of briefing, members of the state assembly and Senate. And so then as I mentioned, I am a data scientist. So ultimately, there's not too much of that in this conversation, but I'm happy to talk about the data specifics of this and, land use stuff broadly. But this meant, okay, so how do we figure out what would it mean if this bill got passed, right, for California? So at a high level, I got basically all the parcel data for all of California, which, you can get from county assessors' offices. And then from there, we have a universe of all these possible parcels. And then we're like, okay, so we're going to use municipal use codes, which are going to be different at the county level, because of course, why would you standardize such things? And owners' names to try to, filter it down first to be like, okay, what do we think are most reasonably properties being used in this way? And then there's some environmental provisions in this bill, saying you can't have parcels adjoining industrial land or within 3,200 feet of oil wells. So you need to kind of mark all of that out and remove those from your analysis. And then, so for the paper that we published maybe a month and a half ago, we provided another filter where we removed parcels that are under 10,000 square feet. This is because projects that are smaller than that are not likely to be suitable for the low-income housing tax credit or program, or LIHTC, which is how the majority of affordable housing is currently financed in this country. We are going to be putting out kind of some follow-up research where we remove that filter and kind of talk about, and as I will be as well later in this presentation, thinking through like there are other ways of building affordable housing outside of that regime, which is one of the things that I think excites us about, especially the church land space. But again, for this, we're really thinking about what might be viable under that system. So in doing that, we found about 171,000 acres of potentially developable land in California, about 47,000 of which were owned by faith-based organizations. For context, in total, that's over 6 times South Bend's total land area. Which is a lot of land to unlock, right, to come to affordable housing. Right? Certainly not all of this is going to be converted, and we thought for a long time, right, I had building data, and I was going through, and I'd been like, okay, we can carve out where the existing buildings are and think about, how developable certain parcels are, and realize that's a touchy game to get into, right? I didn't really feel comfortable on the research side thinking through what exactly do we think people are going to do with this land, right? But we just were like, okay, can we provide some broader context, to the legislature as this is being discussed of like, how much could this help the housing problem in California, right? And the answer was hopefully quite a lot. But I think most importantly, and this is, a lot of the work that we were, finding throughout this, was it's not just that this is a lot of land, which it is, it's where this land is, right? So about a third of these parcels were in areas that had high quality transit. And over 40% of these were in either high opportunity neighborhoods or single family neighborhoods. High opportunity zones this is something that the California State Treasurer's Office designates. It's a rather convoluted system where you basically get certain points for a series of environmental indicators and school outcomes and all this, and then they rank different neighborhoods throughout the state, broadly with the idea that there's a large body of research showing that especially for children, if you grow up in what we think of as high opportunity neighborhoods, your life outcomes are significantly improved, right? But often, we find as people who work in the affordable housing space, like the places where it would be most beneficial to place this housing is, of course, where you have the strongest and most organized opposition to doing so, right? And so we're really excited to see, this is going to be this is a lot of this is places where currently, because of existing zoning and local opposition, you just would never get to build any of this housing. And then this dovetails quite nicely with the state's affirmatively furthering fair housing, kind of racial equity and economic equity goals, and well as climate goals, right, by access to good transit. And those numbers, especially in the major cities where this is a bigger problem, like I think in San Francisco, it's like 100% of the parcels are within a half mile of high quality transit. So, what does this kind of like look like on the implementation side? Again, I know, probably a lot of people who are, much more familiar with this than I am in this room, but, kind of from speaking to groups, what we broadly realized was like, well, okay, there's really no formal help at the federal or state level, which is of course following decades broader U.S. federal policy from moving from providing services to, having nonprofits work with this. But, so LISC and enterprise community partners are some notable examples. There are others, and there are kind of growing attempts to, share resources in this space. But so as mentioned earlier, kind of the main way that we fund affordable housing in the U.S. is through the low-income housing tax credit, which is very competitive and complex. For a separate project I'm working on, I'm basically scraping a bunch of the applications for all of California, and I think there's like 900 data points or something I've pulled out of it right now. It's a lot, right? That paperwork alone is a massive problem, much less the fact that you need to get a bank on board to kind of be as a syndicator. You need to typically have a pretty serious developer on board to be able to kind of get through this process, given the fact that, all of these grants are quite competitive. But again, SB4 is going to help make these projects, I think, more financially viable in this system. But also notably, as we were saying earlier, LIHTC really favors larger projects. But again, this isn't to say that it can't be done. Certainly, you can see on the right, there's St. Paul's Commons, which is in Walnut Creek, which is a suburb of the Bay Area, where they recently built a 45-unit affordable housing space that also had, an attached nonprofit meeting space and center for people, like in that community, kind of using those funds. And again, this is before SB4. So it was possible, but again, it really, it takes partnership with sophisticated developers. On the other side of this, something we kind of in the affordable housing space are really interested in, especially in light of SB4 is, what we see broadly as a need for diversified and flexible sources of affordable housing funding, right? Like LIHTC is overburdened, and it's great, but it can't produce all the housing that we need. And so we're trying to think through, where are other spaces, where can funds come from, right? And so churches are going to be even better positioned after SB4 to organize private funds. They already have a clear moral mission and, broader fundraising networks, right? And, also kind of in that space that can really open up smaller scale projects, right? Like tiny homes and things like that just we really can't afford, or we can't fund in our current funding regimes. And I guess another, note that we got after talking to a lot of churches in this kind of space was, some churches were apprehensive about building homes under LIHTC because then you are subject to kind of federal regulation about who can be in that housing, which again, that is great. But some congregations want the flexibility to be like, no, we want to provide this for members of our congregation in this very specific way, right? And kind of doing these smaller scale projects, kind of private funds do allow you to do that. And so for an example, this is a currently in project, kind of a big part of the California YIGBY movement in San Diego. There's Bethel One, which is an in-process 26-unit for vets and seniors project happening down there. That's just been kind of crowdfunded by the church. I'm running up on time, but thank you so much. We are very excited. Again, this bill, SB4, just passed a few weeks ago. We are going to be following it very closely because we fully understand that removing some of these zoning barriers is, an important part of this discussion, but certainly implementation is where it matters, right? You can make these things easier, but this is, no small feat to actually get this stuff built. And so we will certainly be following that discussion and any subsequent legislation that comes from it. Thank you for your time. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions. Sure. Oh.
Hi, good presentation, very good, and nice to see a fellow Californian in the room. The 172 acres that you estimated, just wanted to clarify, that is exclusive of existing buildings on those properties, like say, it's not.
It is not. Sorry if that was confusing. We decided to basically just take all of the land, like the full universe of land, absent those restrictions of the bill, right? So removing, we took a pretty conservative approach to anything remotely considered industrial. We're going to throw out if it's adjacent to a property, and then that excludes all the smaller plots. So it is still kind of there's an asterisk next to it either way, but that is including building space currently. Although we can do analysis that goes the other way. Yeah.
Ditto. Thank you. Great presentation. What does SB4 require regarding the ongoing ownership of the faith-based or nonprofit entity in the development? The land or the JV, things like that.
My understanding is that the church, it would have to still be owned by the church. So I'd imagine this is like a ground lease situation. But I would.
As long as they own the land, that qualifies, even if they do a JV or something where the vertical is owned by someone else?
I believe so. But yeah, I would definitely want to double check that. But yes, I do believe that's correct.
Quinn, thanks for your presentation. On SB4, the IGB law, so it seems like it facilitates a lot more potential in this space.
Yep.
Like as you said, clearing up some of the zoning barriers, the years of environmental review, et cetera.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, though, in terms of, as a policy matter, why not go even further in the sense of, there's still some limitations. I know it's focused on affordability, but, most of the units have to be 30 to 50% AMI.
Yeah.
There's some, open it up, because the idea would be not necessarily to shift where you're targeting, but to get a lot more deals done where the nonprofits working with developers could do even more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this bill came out of a couple of years of negotiations between many, many interested parties, right, to kind of like land where it did. But I mean, I agree. I would love a more expansive version of this, certainly, and happy to talk more about that after. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that last example in San Diego, and also just in terms of your research, how you're thinking about, from a policy perspective, housing units that are privately owned that are not rent regulated from a government perspective, right? Kind of the challenge that you mentioned in terms of churches wanting to house congregants or be able to select residents of a housing development.
Yeah. Sorry, do you?
So, do you consider that affordable, or is it more addressing a supply issue of just creating more housing?
Yeah, it is. So it would still be either, if it was to use the streamlining benefits of SB4, it'd still be required to follow the same affordability restrictions, right? So like that would still be in place, but then you just basically otherwise it is not legal if you're using LIHTC funds to be like only members of a given church, like faith in my community will be accept an application for, right? Like you can't do that. But if you privately fund something, you could. But if you're using SB4, it would still have to be that economic population where they're between 30 and 50% of AMI. Broadly, more in California, we want more housing.
Right.
So
just to follow up to that, under SB4, a church could develop affordable housing within the AMI bracket, but would they then be able to select who the residents of the
only
housing
if they use privately funded. Only if they privately
okay.
funded it. Yeah. Once you take federal funding, no.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So just a
Sorry, last
I'm the last one, okay, I love being the last one. So for anybody who came to the session I did about housing for refugees earlier, my final slide is about a group out of Louisville, Kentucky. They're called Launch Capital Partners, and it's an equity investment firm actually for real estate, and then they use the investments to buy properties and big properties, and then refresh them, and then rent almost exclusively to refugees and newcomers. So again, because it's private money, so I think, and they'd love for other people to do what they're doing. So there is this movement or this reality where people do invest privately, and of course churches use their own money to fund, where then you can't say, no, I want to rent to this group of people. So
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Great. Thank you.